Welcome to this week's edition of Readings in Theological German, where we're currently working through a full article translating the whole thing from German into English. That article is entitled Priestly Rule, or Rule of Priests, or something like that. People of Priests, or What Else? Towards an Interpretation of Exodus 19:6. So the section that we're reading today, the text problem, or problem of the text, and the possibilities for interpretation. With all the problematic nature, or you might want to say the questionability or the difficulty, and controversy. Now this word here, Strittigkeit, you're welcome again for that beautiful pronunciation that was terrible. Strittigkeit, you probably won't find it when you go to look it up in your dictionary, and so I like to just every once in a while review strategies. Well, what you will find though is this word strittig, which is an adjective, and so as you're looking and not seeing Strittigkeit, you might notice this and go, well, it's got to be related. Of course, you know that kite is what you put on the end of an adjective to form an abstract noun, which is what that is, why you have a capital uppercase S there. And so you look up the adjective, you see that it means contentious or controversial, and then you just have to turn that into a noun in English. And so that's why I said controversy. So with this by here, you might actually want to translate this as despite, because when you get later in the sentence, you see dennoch, which is going to be translated as nevertheless. And so despite might just be more nuanced for by in this particular context. So despite all the difficulty and the controversy, there is, es gibt, never forget to always translate that as there is, unless in some bizarre, rare instance, it's actually talking about an indefinite pronoun of some kind giving something to someone else, but I doubt it. Okay, es gibt, there is, nevertheless, presently, in a few points, or you might say on a few points, a relatively broad consensus. Exodus 19:3-8 counts as a literary unity. So contrary to the older research or scholarship, ist, this is your sein verb, and the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what's it doing? Is this forming an equative clause, or is this forming a perfect tense clause? Because sein can be an auxiliary verb for a perfect tense. When it is an auxiliary verb, it has to take a participle as a complement, and so you look down here and you see worden. That is the past participle of werden, and you might be saying, hold on, I thought geworden was the past participle of werden. Well, there are no other forms of the verb werden that take that O vowel form other than the past participle, and so I think some people are starting to see the ge prefix as a bit superfluous, and they're getting rid of it, which is totally consistent, because as you see in a moment, lots of participles in German that are past participles don't have the ge prefix, although perhaps they used to. And so it's sort of the erosion of the distinctiveness of these forms is what you're actually witnessing here. Worden. Okay, so that's the past participle. But if you have werden, the first question you have to ask yourself then, or I guess the second question now, is what's werden doing? Because it can also be an auxiliary verb to form a passive construction. And so you look ahead of it here, you see just before this other verb, and the sort of dictionary form is detieren, the infinitive form. And detier could be a present third person. However, it is also the past participle. So again, no ge prefix here. It's the past participle too. So that past participle working together with the werden verb is going to be a passive construction, and then with the sein verb is going to be a perfect tense. And so you're going to say something like has been dated. And actually, generally speaking, that's the one nice thing about worden, is that if you ever see worden or geworden, you can pretty much just always translate it with the English word been, because it's always going to be in a passive construction, pretty much without fail. Okay, well, what has been dated? Let's get the rest of the sentence here. We need a subject. Well, you're looking for a nominative noun. The first thing you see after the kind of conjugated verb is a prepositional phrase, and then another prepositional phrase, and then another prepositional phrase. And so you're kind of looking, and you finally get down here, der Text. That is a nominative masculine noun, so that's going to be your subject. And so you're actually going to say, contrary to the older research or scholarship, the text has been dated relatively late in the last 30 years, that is to say the last 30 years of scholarship, above all under the influence of the investigation or research of Perlitt. It puts or sets in any case, this is kind of an interesting little phrase. We use that same phrase in English, except in German, it's not exact equivalence, okay? So jede normally means every or each, but any, I mean, it's a close synonym, obviously. And auf, instead of in, but fall, of course, means case. And so you just have to kind of notice that it's, from the context, doing a discursive type of function, and then just think, okay, well, in English, I'm going to say in any case. So sometimes those things can trip you up because you'll try initially to just translate them literally if you haven't seen that phrase frequently, and that's fine. And you'll just have to kind of think, well, that sounds wooden, but you'll have to just be imaginative about what kind of English discourse marker you might use. So in any case, it sets Deuteronomistic theology in front. Okay, I did that on purpose, but you're going to notice here that this is a prefix which actually goes with the verb up here, setzen. And to set in front, well, it's easiest to just look up the full verb in the dictionary, voraussetzen, which means to presuppose. But you can see semantically why you would have this type of separable verb to mean something like presuppose. It's the same as like a phrasal verb in English that we often use. And so in this case, to set in front is to presuppose. So I just did that on purpose, though, to show you that you don't have to always worry about like, oh, I got to check all the time for a separable prefix at the end of the clause. You can just go ahead and translate it in the order that it's there, because usually when you get to the end, you'll still wind up with something that kind of like sounds like a sentence in English. It just might not make a lot of sense, and it will kind of then clue you in to go look up something a little more nuanced, so that's fine as well. Anyways, then you have here another verb. You essentially have a second clause here, and the subject is elided, and so you actually need to pick up this pronoun up here and say it. And you might want to also supply a conjunction or something, say and possibly, because this kind of follows from the first part of the sentence. And because it follows from it logically, I think that's why you have the elision and a more kind of compact syntax, is because of that logical kind of following relationship. Eher is a word, which normally means something like rather. Here you might want to say something like more likely. It's a kind of a contrastive adverb, and so you're going to say it is more likely post-exilic, which follows from the fact that it presupposes Deuteronomistic theology. In recent work, now you'll notice here this is really technically a superlative, and you might want to say in the newest work, which you could say, I mean, it's not wrong, but typically you'll find that this word is translated as recent in these contexts, because recent work in terms of scholarship, when it's being compared to older research, is always the newest work. And so that's just kind of what you're referring to, but it just sounds better in English to say recent. In recent work, ist, here again, your sein verb, you want to go to the end of the clause and try to see if there's a verb down there or something to pick up so that you know it's not equative. And you do see here that zu beobachten is an infinitive. It's a zu construction. And zu constructions with sein verbs will often have to be translated in English as passives. They're not passive in German, but they have to be translated that way to sound right in English. And so you're going to say something like is, you could say to be observed, or you could just say is observed. And so in recent work, is observed, what's observed? A stronger trend toward a very late dating. And then you have this kind of secondary phrase here that fills out very late dating. Closer to the end phase of the formation of the Pentateuch. So before we translate this, I want to deal with this verb here, handeln, which you can see is a reflexive verb. And the reason I want to deal with it is that it actually functions here with this preposition, and you'll see that that preposition occurs 3 times. Those are all going to work with that verb. And, well, the thing is, that verb normally means something like to trade or negotiate, to bargain. Sometimes it can mean like to act in a particular manner or something. But when it's in this kind of phrase with the preposition and it's reflexive, it doesn't have a word in English that really goes with that verb as such. It's more a phrase that kind of has a discursive function, and so you have to look it up in the dictionary and just see what your kind of phrases in English might be. And so you see here when you look up the reflexive form of this verb that you don't have any glosses, okay? So normally you would have a gloss here in English and then some explanations. There are no glosses because you can't really gloss it in this context. And so you'll just notice here that here it's going to be things like dealing with. And you can kind of see the semantic connection even in English between dealing and bargaining. or trading, right? But it's kind of, a metaphorical extension of that type of term, and that's what's going on here in German. And so you can see here as well, when you have etwa handeln sich, that it's going to, to be about something. And you might even say to be a question of, or something like that. And so that's kind of what's going to govern this sentence, is that sort of phrase in English. Okay, so it's just important to know that sometimes you got to use your dictionary not to get lexical equivalents, but to figure out how an actual phrase works in German. And the dictionary will show you those kinds of examples if there's like a relevant meaning that's specific to a particular combination of that verb with a certain preposition. So it is not, therefore, a question of a scattered, which is to say really old, Traditionstück, fragment of tradition, something perhaps from the time of a pre-state tribal union, for instance. Rather, then you have this again, so you know it's still that same phrase that you're dealing with. Rather, it is a question of a, now watch this, specifically for the present or existing context formulated text. What is this? One of these crazy, heavily modified nouns. So remember, when you're dealing with these kind of things, when you see something that sounds confusing and like terrible grammar in English like that, if you do it woodenly, you want to take your article here and put it back with its noun, because that's where it goes. A text, okay? So that is the kind of object here, or the object of this, thing that we're discussing. So it is a matter of a text. Okay, then you can modify it with the rest of this. What kind of a text? A formulated text. Okay, a text that is formulated specifically for the existing context. Although Zusammenhängen you often will translate as context, but in this case you might want to say framework, only because down here you have a context as well. And so to keep them kind of the nuance distinction between these two German words, you might want to use two different English words. Okay, so rather it is a text formulated specifically for the present framework, that is kind of the framework of the Sinai pericope, if you're tracking the whole context of the article here. Thus, it's about, or it's a matter of, a Erweiterung im Horizont. Somebody asked me if I could please read the sentences fully in German before I translate them, and well, there you go. I gave you a phrase. How about that? I just don't do it really because my pronunciation is so terrible. Also, it would make the videos a lot longer, and this one's getting way too long. So what is it? It's thus a expansion in the horizon of a literarily wide-ranging context. Okay, thanks for hanging in there, people. As always, thanks for watching. Please do like and subscribe and share with all your friends. And I do hope you find these longer videos with more substantial interaction with larger stretches of text to be helpful. As always, welcome your comments and feedback as well. So do interact as much as you can or want. See you next week.